Good afternoon. Good morning, everybody. Again, this is Nick Mitchell-Bennett from Brownsville from cdcb. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this webinar on the definition of colonias, and what's in the name was the title that we gave this webinar. Thanks for joining us and being a part of this webinar. We've got some great speakers today to kind of go through the issue and show how you may be able to help right now in getting this kind of getting the definition settled, at least for one federal agency. As many of you may know, colonias really don't have a definition. The state of Texas has one, the federal government has another one, and then HUD has one, and USDA has one, or they don't have one. It's probably more the way it goes. FHFA is currently now proposing to use a definition called the Colonia investment area, which was created by one of our guests today and through a study that he did, and he'll go into that. But the overall importance of this issue is that colonias, although they are highlighted in many federal and state, whether it be New Mexico, California, Arizona, Texas, grant applications, there really isn't an understanding of what a colonia is. And as I said, there's different definitions. What's a colonia, what's not a colonia, the difference between New Mexico and Texas and the other states. And so being able to get the federal government to sign on to one single definition is really been something that those of us who have been working in the colonia areas for years, it's kind of been our holy grail, just to be able to standardize and level funding and attention, whether it be state, local, or federal funding. And this last year, or last couple of years, through some work that Lance George of Housing Assistance Council did, and then the few of us kind of pushing that definition, FHFA has decided to try to adopt this, and so they're now taking statements and taking support letters for that, comment letters for that, which are due this month, and Daniel Elkin will go into that. But it's a really important issue, just to level the playing field for the colonia areas. Today, so I'm going to shut up now and get on to the people who actually know what they're talking about. We've got three folks with us today who are going to kind of talk about the colonia issues and why this is important. First up will be Dr. Daniel Elkin, who is the Director of Policy Impact and Innovation here at cdcb. And he will kind of give an overview of the duty to serve, which is really where this is coming from the Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae rules, where they fund projects and fund loans for housing. And so he'll talk about that. And then Amber Arriaga Salinas, who's the Assistant Director at Proyecto Azteca, a wonderful organization working here in the Valley and done most of their work over the past 30, almost 40 years now in the colonias. She's going to talk about some of the challenges to just affordable housing in the colonias and why this new definition would be really important for us. And then finishing up will be Lance George, who's the Director of Research and Information at the Housing Assistance Council. And he's going to talk about the colonia investment area tracks and the methodology to the study he did, and why adopting this this definition would be really good for FHFA. And I will quickly just say that my goal, and I believe others as well, but I can tell you my goal as someone who's been working in the colonias for almost 30 years now, is to have all federal agencies adopt this same definition. That will really increase funding and economic development in colonia areas. It'll allow counties to adopt this as well. and standardize funding for them, and smaller cities who have colonias in them. If we can get not just FHFA, but USDA, HUD, Treasury, Health and Human Services, if everyone could be on the same playing field, would really be great. So we now have a shot at FHFA. And so, Daniel will go into more how you can show your support for that. But that's my goal for this. And Daniel and his team at CDCB will, really be pushing this through our policy group called People Policy Power, or P3. So be on the lookout for information coming from them as well on this. So that's enough of me yakking, and I will turn it over to Daniel. You're mute, Daniel. You're still mute.
There we go. Sorry, it wasn't clicking for me. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nick, for that wonderful introduction and for bringing me in. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I'll go ahead and start off by saying, kind of reiterating what Nick said, which is that what prompted this webinar was a proposed rule from the Federal Housing Finance Agency, which is the main regulator of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And in effect, what this rule change would do is kind of update and modernize the definition of colonia as used by the agency. A quick dive into why this matters. Fannie and Freddie exist as government-sponsored entities to provide liquidity, stability, and affordability to mortgage markets. As part of this, they also have what is known as a duty to serve traditionally underserved markets. These include markets such as manufactured housing, affordable housing preservation, and rural housing. Now, there's a lot that's kind of packed into this, and we won't get into all of it. Instead, we'll just kind of get into what matters for us here today, which is that layered within duty to serve are additional categories that Fannie and Freddie need to document that they are making efforts within to achieve their goals. The one that we're going to talk about today are high needs rural regions. First, let me ask, can we see my screen? Am I sharing? Are we good?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. Okay, so these high needs rural regions are specific geographies that the FHFA has identified as having particularly acute financing needs with low-income households. So let's go into what those regions are. First and foremost, it's Middle Appalachia. Second, Lower Mississippi Delta. Third, a colonia. And fourth, a tract located in a persistent poverty county that is not included above. So right away, I think we can look at this list and see a challenge right there in front of us. Middle Appalachia and Lower Mississippi Delta are specific geographic areas. A colonia is not, right? Not in the same way. And so you can see there's a lot of weight that's going to be placed on this definition of a colonia. And this is a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is updating that definition and making it so that it carries more teeth within the duty to serve regulatory framework. Because if I ask, where is Middle Appalachia? If I ask, where is the Lower Mississippi Delta? You can kind of point to it on a map. A colonia, that's not the case necessarily. I mean, you can vaguely gesture to the US-Mexico border and you would be vaguely right, but there is not necessarily that specific place that you can point to like the other categories. So it raises this kind of question of how do you define colonias? And for affordable housing advocates on the US-Mexico border, that answer is often, you know it when you see it, or you certainly know one when you speak to people who live in these communities and hear about their challenges and the things that they face on a day-to-day basis. But efforts to kind of turn that experience into that concrete definition has been elusive. And understandably so, as fundamentally ad hoc communities, informally built by people pushed to the margins, colonias really by their very nature defy definition, And so for decades, federal policymakers have attempted to really kind of do almost the impossible, which is define a colonia. And by doing so, they've unsuccessfully been chasing evolving situations and evolving contexts on the ground. To give you a little bit of history on this, during the latter half of the 20th century, colonias were largely located along the edges of agricultural economies. But since the passage of NAFTA in 1994, the character of colonias has shifted quite a bit. Here on this slide, you can see a map of the US-Mexico border that shows the kind of large growth in population in rapidly expanding urban areas along the US-Mexico border. Again, NAFTA kind of changed the game for how these communities were forming. They are no longer in response to kind of agricultural life and agricultural communities. These are now responses to rapid urbanization. These are informal home dwellings being built in this kind of an environment with this rapid changes going on around them. And over time, as these changes happen, the definitions kind of failed to account for these shifts. Whether it was narrow geographies, I'm sure Lance will give us some background on this later, but whether it was narrow geographies, as in only 150 miles within the border, that's it for what can be considered a colonia, or if it was contradictory parameters at the state and county level, right? We have different definitions at the state level, county level, local level that are often contradictory. And at times the federal government kind of just pointed to these and said, well, there you go. These are what we're going to go with. But again, there was a lot of a lack of clarity. So these continued efforts to define things kind of missed the mark. And this left GSEs, the government-sponsored entities like Fannie and Freddie, I should say, without really guidance as what counted as duty to serve, right? They're trying to meet these certain requirements, but again and again, they're not really sure what is a colonia, what counts in their duty to serve criteria. And so to kind of drive this point home, on this next slide, you'll see here, GSE activity as accounted for in single-family loan purchases in those geographies that I mentioned previously. So from 2018 to 2021 is what we have data for. We see here rural tract and middle Appalachia. You see numbers in the thousands, in the tens of thousands in activity. In the lower Mississippi Delta, again, we're seeing in the thousands. And then on the third line there, you're seeing Colonia. Right away, it should stick out to you that this activity is basically non-existent. And again, a lot of it comes back to simply not having a clarity on what counts as a colonia, has left the GSEs unable to really kind of hone in best practices on how to serve these communities. So it's a huge problem and one that needs addressed. And I think we'll get into it a little bit later. I'm going to dive into some case studies here, some case examples that we have here in Cameron County. But Lance George and his research with HAC, I think, has really kind of created a definition that can finally address the problem that you see in this graph. And he'll get into the specifics of what specifically he's come up with and what FHFA is proposing on that. But again, I'm trying to kind of just show you and showcase what this resulting confusion in what is a colonia, what it results in. So that's that slide. Let's move on to some case studies. Here in Cameron County, we have Cameron Park, which is the largest colonia in the United States. With a population of a little over 7,000 residents and a median income of $31,000, it is a perfect example of this kind of changing context of a colonia. Because over time, the city of Brownsville has grown around Cameron Park. It has surrounded Cameron Park. And with it, these incorporated areas with with access to more resources and part of the city, so they have political representation. You can see here, as it's grown around, you have areas of higher median household incomes. So again, in this map, you can see the darker the purple, the higher the median income. And you can see we've got as high as 116,000 a median household income, and as low as 72,000 in this areas surrounding Cameron Park. Within Cameron Park itself, major discrepancy, right? We have median household incomes closer to 31,000. And so even as the city has grown around it, this area has not been incorporated by Brownsville. It is really kind of left on its own in many respects. Even as water and certain the infrastructure situation around water and things of that nature have improved over time, you still see lack of adequate housing in this area, and of course, lack of access to credit, which leads to a number of deficiencies, including, we have roughly 19 predatory lenders in this region for every regular financial institution, right? So this lack of access to credit, specifically Colonias, I think are representative of a specific example of that problem. They are like, what I would liken to is almost like these islands within these cities. Which brings us to this, again, this need for clarity and definition. This is, for all intents and purposes, Cameron Park lives a rural reality, right? If you go through and you speak to someone who lives in Cameron Park and you say, okay, what are the issues that you're facing? The things that they're going to list off in terms of access infrastructure, in terms of having to contract out social services at a premium to other municipalities, local areas, you name it, the kinds of things that they're going to list off as main problems are the same problems that you would find in any parts of kind of what we recognize as rural America. Those lists that we just went through: Appalachia, Mississippi Delta, Indian country. So there is a need here to kind of define colonias in a way that recognizes that rural nature and that rural reality and that lived experience of what is truly kind of a rural area. And I bring all this up because Cameron Park is not considered rural in the latest kind of definitions under FHFA and duty to serve. It's not a rural area, and therefore does not fall under the high needs rural region parameters. So this is something that we need to address. Another kind of case example that I wanted to bring up, just to kind of talk about those conflicting definitions, is the Encantada Colonia. This is in the kind of rural portions, outer edges of our county. And again, this is an area where there are conflicting definitions. Cameron County's definition, mapping of the Encantada Colonia is wide. It's extremely large, right? Whereas the state's mapping of the Encantada Colonia is very small. So again, if you're an organization, let's say like CDCB, and you want to do work in the Encantada Colonia, which part of it falls within which definition? Which part of it are you going to be able to work with federal entities to kind of know what programs you can use in these areas? It's unclear, even for a local nonprofit that lives in or adjacent to these communities and works with them. We don't know. We can't get an accurate sense of where our work is going to hit certain points and certain parameters. So again, this is just another example of where these definition, lack of focus and lack of clarity kind of comes in. So what do we need as we move towards a definition of colonia for the 21st century? One is, I think we need a stable methodology, right? In order for the GSEs and by that I mean Fannie and Freddie, in order for Fannie and Freddie to kind of jump into these regions and increase their activity, they need something that they know is going to be stable and something that they know is something they can continue to identify over time as, okay, this is what it means to be a colonia, at least for terms of purposes of our activity. So it needs to be stable, something that's going to last. Two, it needs a little bit of built-in flexibility to adapt to the changing context, right? Just as I said, NAFTA changes the game in the 1990s for these communities. Certainly, these communities are always changing, right? These people are in colonias, in these communities, they are living their lives. And so these communities are always going to be shifting. They're informal by their very nature. And so we need something that can kind of adapt. Certainly, I would guarantee 20 years from now, what exactly a colonia looks like or feels like is going to be a little bit different than it was 20 years ago. And so there needs to be flexibility in how we do this. Third, as I mentioned, there needs to be a reflection of that rural reality in terms of development, right? Regardless of where they're located on a map, people in these communities live a kind of rural reality, at least in terms of access to credit, resources, and other items. And then lastly, whatever definition we come up with really needs to be adopted across all federal agencies. And again, I believe that the Colonia investment definition that Lance George and his team have come up with addresses all three of the top issues, right? It's a stable methodology, it's got flexibility, and it reflects that kind of rural reality regardless of where a colonia is located. So if we can achieve all three of those with the definition that Lance is going to kind of give you, his methodology, then if we got it right once, let's keep getting it right and let's get it through all federal agencies. Certainly this matters not just for Fannie and Freddie, it also matters for USDA. It also matters for HUD, it matters for Treasury, you name it. This is something that comes up again and again for programs that are designed to get resources to the areas that most need it. So my call to action for today, before we kind of move on to the next speaker, I just wanted to kind of mention really quickly is if you are in favor of adopting Lance George's Colonia definition, and FHFA is proposing to do just that, we will invite you to comment. FHFA invites comment letters, and those are due on December 5th. At the conclusion of this webinar, we'll make sure to send all of you kind of a form letter. So that way it's nice and easy. You just kind of can fill in your name, personalize it as much as you want to, and then we'll give you clear instructions on how to get that to FHFA to show your support for this movement and to really kind of finally solve this riddle and most importantly, help the communities that need it the most and get some resources in there. So that's all I have. I'll go ahead and with all of that, turn it over to Amber and she'll give you a little bit more on the ground experience of dealing with some of the challenges of colonias. Amber, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate, that was a great opener. I think especially all of your discussions about rural and the isolation. That is absolutely what we're seeing. I will speak more about colonias in Hidalgo County. I think that for us, in Hidalgo County, we have 937 of the registered colonias in the state of Texas. And we look at areas like Cameron Park and think, wow, they have come so far from where colonias are, because colonias for Hidalgo County, we don't have garbage collection. We do not have access to public transportation. There's so much isolation that causes such a challenge, but the things that we see that need to be streamlined are the housing structure and the access to funding. So challenges that we see in colonias are the inadequate or lack of infrastructure. Of course, the rural isolation, and now that I see even in those urban areas, that isolation is there. They're very much islands that need to be helped. Severe flooding, because these colonias were built on former agricultural land, which was made to retain water. The infrastructure hasn't been developed, and then everything around it is growing so rapidly that when it rains, all of the new pavement of the new developments, it just runs off into the colonias and stays there. So these families have really no way to get out, and the isolation just continues to increase. There's lack of urban amenities for our families in colonias. So there are no sidewalks, there are no parks that are easy to access. Even grocery stores are so far removed from colonias. In the valley, you're kind of 30 minutes from everywhere. So imagine if you were a very low-income family that lives in a colonia that's very isolated, that needs to get to the grocery store or a doctor, but you only have one vehicle, and the one family member that works has that vehicle. So how do you get to the places that you need to go? And of course, there's poor housing quality. And what I mentioned was that we don't have conventional homelessness as other areas might, because our families are so family oriented. So we have a very great amount of overcrowding, where the Texas Secretary of State had once put a rooftop head count at about 3.4 people per household. We're looking at more like 6 to 10 people living in a household, which brings up, rental. People think, well, if there's so many people living in this house in a colonia, they should just rent. One, our families would not be able to afford to pay for the rent. And the other is that they can't rent in colonias. These are actual colonias that we are working in now with Hidalgo County, Urban County, along with the state, and these are registered colonias. This is one. You see a lot of garbage because there's no garbage collection. You see the housing structure is dilapidated, of course. This is a mobile home of a woman. She's disabled. She lives with her 2 children, and she's very sick, but she has not been able to obtain home ownership because of the amount of money that comes into the home. And her children are now just, 21 and 22, and they're both working, but they don't have credit established. So that's very, very difficult. I know that mobile home and reinvestment is one thing that, people look at, but this mobile home was built in the 70s, and they just keep on adding to it. You can kind of see inside here. The woman that lives here has a very, very hard time walking, so she is pretty much homebound. If it rains, this whole area floods. It's very difficult. This is another home in the colonias where we're working. You can see, of course, just the poor structure. It does not deter them from, of course, decorating for Christmas. We're very excited, right? But the other thing is that the cold and rain that we saw just last week, this is affecting our families so much. And how can they be healthy and happy when they're worried about the air coming in from the bottom, the roof leaking, and all of the other challenges? It's very stressful. It's not healthy, and we need to find a way to assist them. This is the back. This is another mobile home. This is the back. What you see here is that a lot of people buy little sheds, like garden sheds, and they just kind of find a way to attach it next to their mobile home. And that becomes, the additional family or 2 family members that are now living on that property. And it's very difficult for us to address. Something interesting with this family is that we're trying to give them solar panels. And because the mobile home has that attachment, the county said, we won't be able to give you the permit to add the solar panels because of the attachment. It's not a proper dwelling. And I said, well, what do we have to do to get it? The solar panels are donated. We want to address energy poverty, right? And they said, well, they would have to tear down or remove the additional structure, which is not an option for our family. They said, you know what, we would love to have the solar panels, especially taking into consideration the power outages and the extreme heat in their utility bills, but they had to walk away because they can't tear down half of their dwelling when their son and grandchild live there. It's just not something that they're open to do. So it's just challenge on top of challenge. This is a home that is actually in the same neighborhood. And this family has been constructing it for the past 15 years. So little by little, when they have money, they're able to add to it. But as you can see, it's been very difficult, and they almost have all 4 of the walls up, but it's something that they'll continue to do. So they finally have their property paid off, and who knows when they'll be able to finish their home. It's the investment and the ability for them to seek money, something reliable where it's not interest through the roof that would completely bankrupt them, is not an option for them. So what option do they have? And in the back, you see this little turquoise. It's a mobile home whose roof flew off a couple of storms ago, not even a hurricane, just a storm. So they were able to get money together, actually, with their COVID checks. They built a roof over it so that when it rains, it's not so bad. So they're just putting Band-Aids on top of big gaping wounds, but that's the best that they have. You also see the extension cord down here. They were passing light to their neighbor because their neighbor's light had been cut off. You think that I'm making it up for this presentation, but this is reality every single day for our families. And this is the inside. You can see how they built it. It's very estilo Mexico, right? They built it how they could. They're marking it off how they can. And I wanted to bring up some concerning new trends, which is that although in 1995, the state of Texas established the model subdivision rules, which said we won't build any more colonias, they will have infrastructure, because we often hear and think that colonias just are isolated regions without anything. There have been amazing improvements. However, we are seeing that for Proyecto Azteca, where we build in colonias in rural, that because of the rapid urbanization around colonias, that rural no longer is a designation that we can use to obtain funding. And one thing that caused the establishment of colonias was that people weren't able to get financing and had to go and they were in isolated areas where they could find cheaper land. But now the price of land has gone up 400% in the last 2 years. Now lots are costing $75,000 or more, and then we're seeing early payoff penalties because we received money from SHOP through HAC. And I know that HAC sees these challenges. They increase the amount of money that we could spend on a lot, but when a lot is costing us $75,000 or more, that's not something that we'll be able to do. We won't be able to build a home for $100,000 and purchase the $75,000 lot. It's just not reasonable. And I actually did this search this morning. So this lot, and you can see in the back the types of homes. It's not a colonia because it has paved roads, right? And they have access to water. That's very true. But the homes and the isolation is very much still there. And this is actually just a street view that I pulled off of Google Maps. So it's not a colonia. It has this very thin road that you know that as soon as it drizzles, there will be major potholes. But the homes are still being built, and who knows how long it'll take for them to actually finish, or maybe they'll just add something else to the home. And here's my information. That's what I've got.
Thank you, Amber. That was perfect. Let's go ahead and Lance, if you go ahead and give us the step in the right direction that you've come up with the Colonia investment area definition.
Wonderful. Thank you, Daniel. Hopefully you can hear me. First and foremost, we would like to thank CDCB and Nick for inviting the Housing Assistance Council to be part of this important discussion. I'm going to try to share my screen because I do think some of the graphics or the illustration will help convey. I think our role here today is to simply provide a technical overview of what Colonia investment areas are. So I'm going to try to share here. And are you seeing the presentation now, Daniel?
Yes, I can see it.
Great. And hopefully it's in the proper mode, or is it in a preview mode?
In the preview mode.
Okay, let's try something else here. Is that working now?
Yes, now we got
Great.
it.
Great, thank you. So sorry for that slight delay. But I think our role here is to just provide some insights into what Colonias investment areas are, and this entire discussion is about definitions. But more importantly, I'm really glad that Daniel and Amber were able to give more contextual insights into this issue. Those discussions are candidly more important than what I'm going to be presenting here. But we'll try to provide you some brief introduction and overview of what Colonia investment areas are. Just to give you a little bit of insight, the Housing Assistance Council is a national nonprofit that supports affordable housing efforts in rural areas. But I like to say we help build homes and communities across rural America, with the operative word being help. We don't build or develop housing. We work with local community-based organizations like Proyecto, Azteca, and cdcb. They know what's best for their communities. We just try to help enable them in a few ways. I won't go through all of the resources that we offer, but one of them is providing data and research and information. I often like to say that we provide data, research, and information to help inform strategies and solutions across rural America, or for rural communities. We primarily, again, work with local community-based organizations. And sometimes that's the primary goal, is to help them better understand their markets and what they need to do. But also to sometimes, because we are based in Washington, D.C., we help inform the national debate. And I'm someone who's probably more critical than most of some of our work, but I do think that the development of the Colonias investment areas is a really good example of that, right? We were trying to provide data and information to help inform strategies, primarily for mortgage access and housing in a long overlooked area of the area of the United States. So I do think it's been a good approach, and it's interesting that it is being looked at a larger scale. But again, the primary goal was to help inform solutions to better provide mortgage access and finance in Colonia communities. So I think that Daniel already really went over candidly the impetus for the development of the definition. So he did a great job there, so we don't have to spend some time on that. But I would like to say that, first of all, this was not done in isolation. A lot of people really worked on this project. It was supported. We appreciate the support and the partnership of Fannie Mae in helping bring the Colonias investment area definition to a fruition. And I would be remiss, I know there's been a lot of terms bandied about Lance George, and it was a TAC team effort along with Fannie Mae, but also I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge our senior researcher, Dr. Keith Wiley, who did a lot of work on this, an immense amount of work. And it's really a lot of his brainchild and his work, and spent many hours working on the development of the Colonias investment areas. In some respects, and I'm going to try to go through this relatively quickly so we can have time for questions and discussion. In some respects, the Colonias investment areas are quite a simple concept. Now, the work getting there and developing it was quite difficult. It was a 2-year project, and it involved a lot of work. But the concept, hopefully, is relatively simple. And in essence, we're going to talk about 3 major components of the project and try to go through them. That we procured and analyzed original data and GIS shapefiles. Then we developed the Colonias with those data, developed the database, and then we conducted a brief analysis of what mortgage access and finance look like in those Colonias investment areas. If we have time, I might hit on a couple of those. I will say, hopefully you can access the full report. It's more than 100 pages long. It has all the technical documentation. It'll be much, it will have much more detail than what I'm able to present here today. So very quickly, just going through the first 3 or 4 steps on how we develop the Colonias investment area. One of the primary requirements under the duty to serve rural was that that you had to identify publicly recognized colonias. I can go into more detail about what that means, but they had to be recognized by official entities. So we identified specific colonia communities from HUD, USDA, EPA, various federal agencies, the states, and local municipalities and a few other entities. But one primary requirement of the Colonias investment areas that had to be already publicly identified. That might sound like you've already got it. But then we had to geocode them, and that's where some of the difficulty came in, was identifying them, triangulating them, quality control checking, and make sure they were actually a colonia, that they were listed on the public list. I'm not going to go into detail. This is a map of Cochise County, some colonias that we identified in different methodologies. I will not go into detail on the intricacies between points and polygons and GIS technology, just to let you know that that is some of the complexity that was involved in developing the definition. And this is just again a geographic illustration of that. The aggregation. So the next major step was to aggregate. So we first identified the colonias. Then we aggregated up to, and this is slightly technical, census blocks, which is the lowest level of geography within the U.S. Census Bureau. And some of this was to, again, Daniel mentioned this, was to normalize or make these adaptable. And I'll go into one important detail. So we identified the census blocks that the colonias were in, and then we aggregated up to the census tract, which is the next highest level of geography. I don't mean to be too technical here, but there's a hierarchy of geographies within the census, and it really starts out at the actual street level, then the block, then the census tract. And we also within the report identified states, because we think there are important trends within states. But the most important thing to remember on this definition is that the census tracts are the primary unit of analysis. That's a research term that we use. And this is a geographic illustration of that aggregation. So the red areas indicate the actual census, the blocks, and then the dark orange areas indicate census tracts where census colonias were located. So the red areas had an actual colonias, and then we aggregated up to the darker orange areas, which are actually technically now a colonias investment area. And I want to highlight why we were focusing on census tracts. And in some respects, I'm good at bad analogies, but we often try to work towards what I would call a Goldilocks approach, right? It's not too hot, not too cold. So the colonias themselves were too small in many respects, and they don't align to standard census geography, so you can't really understand some of the population or housing dynamics within them. Census blocks are actually also relatively small, and they also don't allow for analysis. Census tracts, which are the second lowest level of geography, and they typically, I can go into a long detail about what census tracts are, but they typically entail a geography with between 4,000 and 8,000 people. So it's a good, stable geography. One, that now allows you to do some analytical work with the data, where you can pair up data with that community and understand what is going on. And secondly, another major element, Daniel noted before, the impetus for developing the Colonias investment areas was because of the duty to serve definition, and tracts are the primary geographic unit of analysis for all of the other geographies. So it works really well that you can have a consistent geography, and the Colonias, in some respects, the Colonias investment areas are treated like the other major high need regions or the other underserved communities. So after all of that, we developed a list of the Colonias investment areas, and you'll see overall there were roughly 466 Colonias investment areas, which again are simply census tracts that included a colonia. There were 94 in Arizona, 23 in California, 58 in New Mexico, and 271 in Texas. Now bear with me because I'm going to show an update, but this is just a geographic illustration of those census tracts in kind of a burnt orange or brown that show you where the Colonias investment areas are. And the gray shaded area is the 150 miles north of the US-Mexico border, which was in some respects a definition that was primarily used in the past, right? An often used or identified definition of colonias or in the border region. So if I have a few minutes, Daniel, I'd like to just highlight a couple of trends within Colonias investment areas. What we did with the our data analysis. And just to highlight a few of them, again, we have 40 or 50 pages of this within the full report, but I wanted to identify, and again, another trend that came up was the difference between rural and urban colonias investment areas. So in this bar chart indicates the blue areas indicate rural colonias investment areas, and the orange areas indicate urban colonias investment areas. And you'll note the rural, the majority in Arizona, California, and New Mexico, but Texas has many more urban colonias investment areas than the nation as a whole. And if you aggregate them all together, it's roughly 50-50. About 50% of the colonias investment areas that we identified are in urban areas, and about 50%, a little under 50% are in rural areas. And again, a geographic kind of illustration of that. The blue areas are the rural investment areas, and the orange areas are the urban colonias investment areas. One of the primary indicators that we looked at was just to try to assess the level of mortgage activity. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail other than to note our analysis showed there was a dearth of mortgage lending activity in colonias investment areas. Actually, I think a great indicator of that was the slide that Daniel showed before, where there were only 123 mortgage purchases made out of thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands within the larger areas. And I think that speaks larger than this, but we looked at a ratio of new mortgages to owner-occupied units within various geographies, the U.S., the border region itself, 150 miles north of the U.S.-Mexico border, and then looked at colonias investment areas and rural colonias investment areas. And you'll see progressively much less activity, mortgage activity in those areas. Just going to have two more highlights. The issue of high cost lending. So when there is mortgage activity, oftentimes it is at a much higher rate, right? It costs much more. So for example, the rate of high cost mortgage lending in the colonias investment areas, which is basically a high interest rate loan, was more than double the US or the larger border region rate. And finally, another indicator was just that there are fewer conventional mortgage loans in colonias investment areas. So the blue areas in these geographies indicate conventional mortgage loans, and then the orange, gray, and light orange areas indicate FHA, VA, and USDA loans. And you'll see a higher proportion of loans in the colonias investment areas are with the non-conventional federally backed loans. We don't believe that's an actual clear illustration because we just believe there's a dearth of lending activity in these regions alone. But you'll see this is a good indicator that there's a lack of conventional mortgage lending in many of the colonias investment areas. And I want to end on just one element. Really happy to answer any questions. I know this is a really quick recitation of colonias investment areas. There was a lot of work to go in there, but hopefully you see the simplicity in the tool. But Daniel also noted the adaptability, and this is not major, but it's one element of the adaptability. When we first worked on colonias investment areas, we were working on older data from the 2010 census and older American Community Survey. But just as an example, when the new 2020 decennial census came out, we were able to adjust the colonias investment areas based on those data. And you'll see there was an increase overall from 446 colonias investment areas to 577 colonias investment areas after the release of the decennial census data. So in some respects, this gets a little complicated. I can go into detail, but there was actually an increase in colonias investment areas because of the 2020 census. A lot of that there was simply a lot of population growth. As been noted before, Amber noted this, Daniel noted this, there's just been a lot of population growth in this portion of the nation. And that's also affected the rural urban status as well. But it also shows, I think, the entire methodology or the tool that it is somewhat adaptable. We were relatively easily able to adapt it to the 2020 census, not based on the 2010 census. And then finally, I'll just add two quick maps. This is the final updated map with the 2020 or HACS estimate of colonias investment areas, those 500 and so colonias investment areas. I personally like to break them out differently by state because I think there's a lot of variation in how colonias are defined, how they operate, how they were formed, and how they operate in practice in the 4 different states. But this is a geographic estimate of where the new colonias investment areas are as of the 2020 census. And then finally, one area that I'd like to note is this is just the number, the circle of the concentric circles indicate the number of colonias per colonias investment area. And again, you see some variation. There are a large portion of colonia that are in the state of Texas, and a very large portion of them are in the lower Rio Grande Valley. So you'll note that. So this is just, these concentric circles indicate the number of colonia within each colonia investment area, with the largest, since the colonias investment area, the largest one had 44. And then the smallest would be one colonias within the colonias investment area. Now, I would just stop on this. I really want to refocus on Amber and Daniel's comments. I think that's the most important. I would only reiterate one element, and that is, I talked about some data analysis here, but we did consult with local communities and local community-based organizations in the development of this. We thought that that was extremely important, that you heard their perspective and that some of their work and their insights were involved in creating this as well. So thank you very much, and I'll stop there.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Lance. I think you did a great job giving us the technical but extremely important details on this, and very much complements what Amber was working on with giving us that kind of on the ground experience and how these things are all connecting. So thank you so much. So next up, we'll have kind of questions. And so if anybody has any questions, go ahead and feel free to jump in. Lance, one question I saw right off the bat real quick is if it would be okay if we share this presentation with some of the participants, your slides, would that be okay?
Yes, that would be. I would only note that these are estimates, especially the new, the previous, for the analysis has gone through several levels of review. I would just say the new estimates of the 2020, there may be some minor variation on how entities calculate that. We haven't seen the final list from FHFA. Those are just hack estimates. I would just make that one caveat, but I'm very confident that it's very close.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, if anyone else has any questions, Clarissa's been having questions messaged to her and also kind of following the chat. Clarissa, what do we have?
Okay, so this question is for Lance. The proposed change from FHFA will impact Fannie and Freddie. What, in your estimation, is the biggest barrier to other federal agencies adopting this way of defining colonias?
I don't know how, I don't work for the federal entities or the federal agencies. I do think one barrier will be overcome if FHFA adopts it candidly, and that is now codified by another federal entity. In the past, this simply just didn't have the, for lack of a better term, I'm not an attorney, but it wasn't codified in federal policy. So that would be a major hurdle. I think agencies are much more likely to adopt something that has been vetted by another federal entity. So I think that would be another entity. I would just note that we do think there's some wide applicability here. No definition is perfect. It has primarily been used in the provision of developing mortgage finance. And so it hasn't really been tested out on maybe other resources or commodities. So I think that might be a hurdle. But I think on the positive side, if it were to be codified, that would really improve its likelihood that other federal entities could use it and then see it in practice.
Thank you. Daniel, did you have something to say?
No, go for it. Do we have anything else?
There's also a question for Amber. So in what ways would a concrete definition of colonias help affordable housing in your area?
I think that for Proyecto Azteca, just right off the top of my head, one is that if there's a streamlined definition of colonias, we would have more access to address the housing stock within colonias. And I think that would make a world of a difference for our families. One thing in mind is USDA. A lot of areas that are very much rural for us because of the population are not considered colonias anymore, but they are on the colonia list. So we can't access those USDA funds. It's very difficult to be able to help families obtain a home when it's not on the eligibility map. So that's one way it would really help us. And I think if we would have access to funds like, for instance, we can apply with HAC for SHOP funds, and they focus on the organization and the work that we do here instead of applying to the state. It's just that much easier for us to be able to work because we're on the ground.
Thank you. Let's see.
I'll just jump in real quick. I noticed, Jordana, you asked for the definition to be put up there. I went ahead and put it in the chat so you can kind of see it, just kind of the basics of what is being proposed. I'll go ahead and read through it real quick. The Federal Housing Finance Agency is proposing to amend duty to serve to add a definition of Colonia census tract, which would serve as a census tract-based proxy for Colonia, and to amend the definition of high needs rural region in the regulation by substituting Colonia census tract for Colonia. The proposed rule would also revise the definition of rural area in the regulation to include all Colonia census tracts, regardless of their location. So again, this kind of helps kind of broaden out a lot of the things that we were talking about. Also, I saw in the chat, we would like to, there are many opportunities to comment on policy currently. We would like to support this effort. Can you share a draft comment letters that we could borrow from? Absolutely. We'll make sure as soon as this is over to get out copies of the presentations to everyone who wants one, as well as everyone will receive a draft comment letter that you can personalize as much as you want. And we'll give you instructions on how to submit that to FHFA. Go ahead, Clarissa. I just wanted to make sure those were addressed. Go for it.
Okay. Jordana also asked, a majority of the colonias are in the larger persistent poverty counties of the Texas-Mexico border region. Why is that not recognized?
So Lance, and that, the first slides that I think was part of this presentation, it had colonias, but it didn't say anything about the one of 4 persistent poverty areas of the country is the Texas-Mexico border region, of which colonias are a even more severe poverty within the colonias, but persistent poverty counties, there many of the colonias in the Texas border are within the persistent poverty counties. So
Because
it's true that the federal grants, I mean, I see people having to do all these acrobatics of defining colonia and drawing, doing their maps, to show who they're going to be able to cover with that specific definition of rural. So this goes a long way to help that for sure, because of this lack of understanding of kind of very large areas that you shouldn't have to dissect and say you're going to cover these but not these, and it's a persistent poverty region. They should be we should be able to invest in them in the same way that you do any persistent poverty county.
Jordana, the main reason is because they're no longer rural, and because the persistent poverty definition in the duty to serve regulation says that they're persistent poverty rural counties, and so because of like the example that Daniel gave with Cameron Park is no longer rural, so it automatically falls out of that definition. That's why. So that's why this where in the proposed rule would also revise the definition of rural area in the regulation to include all colonia census tracts regardless of their location.
Yeah, colonias have always been peri-urban and rural and deep rural,
right?
And that's why they formed, because of the urbanization. So that I think that might take care of the rural problem. That has people having to dissect things to qualify for grants, and we're not getting the funding that should be obviously going to this area because of that. But I think this works for the rural problem.
And everybody, if you didn't know, that Jordana wrote the book on the colonias in the 21st century. So when she was with the Fed, so if we can get we got her support on this, then we're going a long way. So that's good. Thank you, Jordana.
Thank you.
I would only add to that very quickly on a technical point. First, we used a lot of your work in the development of this, Jordana, so we really appreciate that. And then secondly, on a minor, just to add, Nick's point is the primary, I think that one of the primary elements, but the difference between the on a technical level on the Colonias investment area versus persistent poverty county is it is at the census tract level. So it is slightly more granular and potentially more targeted. Whereas the persistent poverty counties would include all tracts within that county. Maybe not a major distinction, but could be just a minor distinction on geography alone. So thank you.
And I do want to highlight the reason this is so important across federal agencies, going beyond FHFA, is that, you know, I know that, you know, looking at the folks who are on this webinar today, there are folks from counties and from other cities that are close to colonias or have colonias in them. Those other federal funding sources a lot of times call out your preferential treatment for areas, for colonia areas. However, because there is no definition, someone at Cameron County or Hidalgo County who's looking to get infrastructure funding or transportation funding isn't able to utilize the colonia, the fact that they're serving colonias, because there's no definition and it falls outside of that specific agency, like transportation, like DOT or the Treasury Department or whatever the case may be. And so this would allow more funding to flow into those census tracts that have colonias. So it's not just a housing issue, although the housing issue, obviously, to folks like Amber and myself at Proyecto Azteca and in cdcb is really important. But it also, you know, flows into other issues like infrastructure, like Jordana's working on, you know, bridging that digital divide and being able to get money into those areas that are colonias now, where they're called out as preferential, but then there's no different definition. So what? You call the colonia out in your rule, but you don't even know what it is. That's my big frustration here is go ahead.
We just had to bring NTIA, that's managing the federal funds, major infrastructure funds, to visit Arise and visit some of the colonias, because they weren't even aware, right? So we definitely need that across agencies and the teaching that goes along with it. But there, I think this goes a long way. I'd like to kind of mull over it a little bit in case I can add anything of value, but there is not that understanding, and there's too many rules that don't apply on the ground that aren't real, and so I think this can help, and the challenge will be to get it implemented across agencies.
The one question that was, why would this help? And Amber gave a good example of why it would help, but even just limited to FHFA right now, under the duty to serve rule, they need to be doing more mortgage lending in colonia areas, and they just are not. And CDCB is a Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac seller servicer, so we're able to originate loans in these communities. However, getting the assistance, getting the ability to help, if there's an easy way for them to be able to count that house, that mortgage in a colonia, they are going to go, the extra mile to help us do that, to get a conventional mortgage in these areas. But right now, there's no definition, so they just kind of don't pay attention, and it's not. I'm not blaming the GSEs at this point. I'm very happy that FHFA has decided to take this on, because it will help the GSEs do more lending, and it will help organizations like Proyecto Azteca and CDCB to originate more loans in those communities. And it gets to the point where Amber brought it up and Daniel brought it up, is that we need to eliminate the high cost lending for mortgages, the predatory lending for housing construction and purchasing in these communities, because they're going to predatory lenders. We may not be seeing a lot of contract for deeds anymore, but there's a way that a lot of these developers have been able to get around the contract for deed rules, but still doing high cost predatory loans in those areas. So if we can bring in Freddie and Fannie into the mortgage world, into these communities, it's going to help clean up the mess that's been created. And so even if it just goes to FHFA and nowhere else, it's going to be a huge help. But again, we want to, continue to push this at the other levels so that we can get more USDA 502 loans in there, so we can get more shop loans in there with a good definition, so we can get Treasury Department to be, doing more work with CDFIs that are working in colonias, and them have that same definition. So this is, great work. And I know I'm on that board of HAC, and Lance is just probably the most humble person I know. But he and his team did fantastic work with this and really, really dug deep and come up with something that we, those of us who work in the colonias, he listened to what we had to say and really was able to get that into a very difficult way to explain. He did it very easily, I think, and it may seem hard to him, but he makes it sound so easy. So thank you to HAC and to their work on this and everybody else's. Any more questions, Daniel, or should we wrap up?
Just one other thing. I had a question about where people can access the HAC report on Colonia investment areas. I went ahead and put the link in the chat. And then Lance, a couple of people were wondering, are these databases public that you've used? Is there somewhere we can access them?
Thank you. You have stumped me on that one. I think there's definitely with a link to the report, there should be an interactive map that shows you where all of the Colonia investment areas were as of the 2018 data. It will probably include the 446, not the estimated 557, but we'll probably think about putting that out when we make our comment letter public as well. So thank you for that reminder. But there should be an interactive list of all of the Colonias investment areas, at least from the 2010 census, on that with the link to that report.
Perfect. Well, good. I think with that, I think we're ready to wrap it up, but please keep your eye out for the draft comment letter. Again, make it your own, personalize it, and we'll give you those directions to get it into FHFA. Due date is December 5th. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.